Okay, we are at the top of the hour, so we're going to go on and get started. I first want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I would like to welcome you to our Road to HIPAA Compliance webinar series. Today, we are going to be talking about security incident response. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded, and all attendees will be receiving a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slide deck. Everyone will also be receiving CCB Continuing Education Credit Certificates for today's attendance. Just a reminder that everyone will remain muted throughout the session, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature, which is located on the WebEx toolbar. We'll be monitoring those throughout the hour, and we'll reserve some time at the end to address those. Just to give you a quick background about who we are at Kirkpatrick Price, we are a licensed CPA and PCI QSA firm specializing in information security and regulatory compliance audits, providing assurance services to over 450 clients in more than 46 states, Canada, Asia, and Europe. The firm has over 11 years of experience in compliance frameworks such as HIPAA and HITECH, ISO 27001 and 27799, and NIST. We offer both regulatory compliance and information security services. We provide consulting services such as policy and procedure drafting and review, risk assessment, internal audit plan and development, as well as readiness audits. And we also provide guidance and audit services on frameworks such as HIPAA, SSA 16, SOC 2, High Trust, PCI DSS, FISMA, and ISO 27001. I wanted to take a quick moment before we get started and invite you to connect with us. You can subscribe to our blog for regular industry updates, tips, and best practices. We also keep a library of our recorded webinars located on our website. And LinkedIn is another great way to keep in touch with us and keep up with what is going on in the industry. So now I'll introduce our speaker for today. Mark Heinley is a regulatory compliance specialist with Kirkpatrick Price and a member of the Florida Bar with 9 years of experience in healthcare law, regulatory affairs, and internal compliance in the public and private sectors. His specific experience includes serving in the General Counsel's Office for a state healthcare oversight agency, regulatory affairs for a Medicare, Medicaid, HMO, and complex healthcare litigation. He is also SANS certified in the law of data security and investigations. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome likewise to all of you. You know, as I was looking through, reading through the Kirkpatrick Price introduction that Sarah was sharing a few slides ago, I noticed it says 46 states. And so, you know, I'm guessing that Alaska and Hawaii are states where we may not currently have clients. So if anyone is on this call and is located in Hawaii, I would welcome you to be the first of our current clients to be located there, and I would come personally serve you in your great state. So I want to get that number up to 50. All right, let's do a little bit of a disclaimer before we begin the content of the presentation. This presentation is provided by Kirkpatrick Price for educational and informational purposes only, and it does not constitute legal advice. So no attorney-client relationship is established by viewing this presentation, and if you do need legal advice, please consult with your own attorney. Now that we've got that disclaimer out of the way, let's begin with an introduction as we go through our webinar presentation on incident response. So those terms, security incident response, are used several times within the security rule, and those terms can become pretty vague and repetitive, both in the rule and because these terms are not just something from HIPAA, obviously, but they're contained in a plethora of federal and state regulations and industry practices. So we say security incident response or any combination of those three words, and people generally have an idea of what you mean. But if you're now going to talk about a regulatory requirement, you might wonder, you know, what makes the security incident response requirement in HIPAA different from what people would be generally familiar with. So one of the challenges is being particular and identifying exactly what the rule requires, but the rule doesn't help us a whole lot. It uses the term security incident, I believe, 4 times, but it's, like I said, it's pretty vague, and repetitive. So one of our challenges today will be to try to identify with particularity and specificity what a security incident and security incident response actually means. So in addition to identifying what a security incident is, we're also going to talk about where that definition is going to live, and that's going to be in your systems and your policies. So the security rule specifically requires policies and procedures for incident response, but practically you have to have system monitoring tools to facilitate compliance with this requirement. So we'll talk about systems and policies throughout all of the different sections. And those different sections are going to comprise of several issues that are raised explicitly by Department of Health and Human Services as a way of addressing our security incident response policies and systems. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is something that might come to your mind when you hear the term security incident and HIPAA, and you might think, well, what about breach? Are they the same thing? Are they different? If so, how are they different? So this adds another element of confusion to this topic, because these terms sound and seem similar, but we'll address the differences between the two to hopefully alleviate some of that confusion. So this is where we're headed for today. And now that we've got the introduction out of the way, let's talk a little bit about some of the requirements for security incident response. So the first of those is information system activity review, and I'm going to read the three different requirements. I'm going to read each of these just to demonstrate to you how little specificity is provided within the security rule. So 164.308 requires covered entities and business associates to implement procedures to regularly review records of information system activity, such as security incident tracking reports. So there are a couple of other items listed that would constitute information system activity, but one of the specific ones is security incident tracking reports. So the security rule requires regulated entities to not only have reports of security incidents, but actually review those on some level of regularity. The second requirement is security incident procedures. So the security rule requires covered entities and business associates to implement policies and procedures to address security incidents. Again, really vague, really high level, and still just using the term security incidents. The third and final of these requirements is response and reporting. So the rule requires regulated entities to identify and respond to suspected or known security incidents, and then mitigate, to the extent practicable, harmful effects of security incidents that are known, and document security incidents and their outcomes. So to sum up these three different requirements, you've got to identify and respond to security incidents, and then that response should include mitigation. You have to have policies and procedures that govern the response and documentation reporting, and then you have to have a regular review of your security incident tracking reports to ensure that risks are identified and addressed. All three of these requirements are required implementation specifications, which means that you cannot implement one or more alternative security measures to accomplish the same purpose as security incident procedures or information system activity review. The law does not permit an alternative for any one of those three items. So that means you have to have policies and systems, and you have to have policies and systems that address these specific elements. So policies and procedures: identify and respond to incidents, mitigate harmful effects, and then document those incidents and outcomes. So how do we go through these different requirements and come up with a solution that aspires to compliance with these three different requirements under 164.308? Well, the way to do that, I think, that is best is to go through several different issues that have been raised by the Department of Health and Human Services in different documentation, and and then answer the questions. And we'll go through different elements for each of these issues. We'll talk about some discussion, and then we'll talk about some aspects that apply to our systems, and then we'll talk about aspects that apply to our policies for each of these 4 different issues. So the first of these issues is defining a security incident. So like I said, the rule refers to the term several different times, and it actually defines it, but in a practical real-world setting, that takes a little bit more effort on our part. The second of those issues is document reporting, specifically how often and to who should security incidents be reported, and then how will incidents be documented and reported? What information is to be contained in a security incident report? And then the third issue will be, what are the appropriate responses to certain incidents? So the actual response part of incident response. And then the fourth and final is trends, whether identifying patterns or trends of attempted security incidents is reasonable and appropriate. So we're going to go through these 4 different issues before we talk about the difference between security incident as defined under the law and a breach. So let's talk about the first one, defining the term or concept of security incidents. The security rule definition is as follows. A security incident means the attempted or successful unauthorized access, use, disclosure, modification, or destruction of information, or interference with system operations in an information system. So you've got a couple of different parts to this legal definition. You have both attempted and successful, or successful and unsuccessful activities can meet the definition of a security incident. So one of the things I think that will help us drive our policies and our systems to a place of compliance is understanding that we can't just include actual breaches, successful disclosures, successful destruction, or successful interference as an incident. It also, the definition of security incident actually includes unsuccessful attempts. So, so that's something that's important in terms of creating policies and creating systems. And then the other part of the definition that's important is it includes a broad array of activities: access, use, disclosure, modification, destruction of information, or one that could be a little bit different than some of the other activities that we typically talk about with HIPAA, interference with system operations. So you could have an activity that doesn't actually access PHI or change PHI, but it just interferes with system operations enough to establish as a security incident. So let me give you a couple of different examples that may help bring this conversation into some specifics, and are some questions that each covered entity and business associate needs to ask when they're defining their policies and their procedures and their systems. Does an unsuccessful email phishing attack count as a security incident? So if someone at a business associate or someone at a provider receives an email that contains an infected attachment, and they click on that attachment and try to open it up, and the phishing attack is unsuccessful, does that count as a security incident? Or what about damage to or corruption of PHI by a virus? That's one that's much more likely to be considered by almost everyone as a security incident. A couple of examples that might be more on the unsuccessful side of things, but could still constitute as a security incident would be access attempts to PHI databases or software. And then you have incidents that are events that might not really be considered an incident, that you would nonetheless need to discuss and establish a policy regarding to determine whether it's a security incident or not. So for example, a scan of a firewall, that could occur thousands of times per day. And so if those events were considered a security incident, the administrative burden of documenting and responding to and investigating and mitigating and reviewing would be almost impossible. So most consider a scan of a firewall as an event, but not an incident. Or a hard drive malfunction that requires replacement, just due to the nature of the hard drive, it was improperly built, or just due to use or age, but no malicious activity, simply a hard drive that malfunctions and then it requires replacement. Many would consider that an event, but not a security incident. And then finally, a power outage that was weather or physical related rather than a hostile act. Almost everyone, or if not almost everyone, would consider that to be an event that impacted system activity, but wasn't an attempt, successful or otherwise, to destroy or use or access or disclose or interfere with system operations. So the first thing in addressing security incidents is taking the regulatory definition and making it practical. And one of the ways to do that is to involve a broad array of people within your organization or outside your organization as you need to. So include information security staff, security officers, compliance, operations, include the whole spectrum of units within your organization that will be dealing with security incidents, both in preventing them and then identifying them and documenting them and responding to them in order to come up with a definition that is both compliant and appropriate for your organization. So you need to come up with a policy definition that takes the legal language and makes it useful for your organization, because just providing a copy and paste of the definition and the security rule won't help when you're dealing with situations like a scan of a firewall. Some of the specifics within a policy documentation, in addition to including a broad array of people to discuss it, so operational definitions of security incidents, listing specific system tools that are designed to detect security incidents, identifying who determines whether an incident has occurred, and then procedural guidelines for what I would call the identification phase. That's the first phase where you're determining whether something is or is not a security incident. So what happens during that phase? Likely you're going to have communication to the security officer or some other designated individual. Then you would have a security officer's review. They're gathering evidence, establishing the chain of custody. They may be contacting legal counsel inside or outside. And then in certain instances, there may be some media interaction if applicable. So those are all some of the items that should be addressed in the policy documentation for defining security incidents and then moving to kind of that first a phase of evaluation, identification phase. And in terms of systems, creating systems that assist in and facilitate your organization's definition of a security incident. So it's one thing to define it in policy, even more usefully than what the regulatory definition is. But if we don't have systems in place that make the policy work, then the policy is insufficient. So some examples of tools that can be helpful are malware scans, virus scans, network intrusion software, baseline security analyzers. Those are tools that detect insecure configuration settings and check various software products for missing security updates. So they basically create, they know what the security baseline should be, and then they can evaluate against that baseline to see if something is missing. And then finally, audit logs. It's important to have audit logs to document different activities, and those audit logs need to be configured so that they can't be altered or changed, so that once the log is created, especially if it were an incident where it would be inside, the documentation is always there, and the person who's acting maliciously can't also impact the audit log. So the first of the 4 issues that we have is defining a security incident, understanding the regulatory definition and creating a policy definition and creating procedures for when your organization is deciding whether or not an event is actually an incident, and then creating systems that will allow your organization to identify activity and determine whether or not that activity is as actually a security incident. The second issue that we're going to talk about is incident documentation and reporting. So this is kind of broken up into 2 different sections. First, how often and to whom should incidents be reported? So initial reporting, and incident reporting should be considered in terms of initial, ongoing, and final. Initial reporting should be done to the security officer or to some security incident response team, however your organization defines it, but it should be spelled out in policy documentation. And it should be done immediately, and it should be done immediately. The second phase of incident reporting is the ongoing reporting, and that can include not only the security officer or the response team, but also management and legal counsel if legal counsel wasn't brought in or management weren't brought in at the initial reporting phase. And then the final reporting would be all of the individuals included in the first 2 sections of reporting, but would just be a report on the final outcome of the investigation and any responses. And at that phase, you're also talking about potentially reporting to business associates, reporting to covered entities. So in order to document both initially, ongoing, and then finally, we have to have policies and systems in place to facilitate that kind of reporting. From a system perspective, this is both going to be the kind of tools that we talked about in terms of scans and audit logs initially, but then also we're going to be talking about other incident reporting systems that could be a number of different options that trigger follow-up steps. So the kind of manually created outside of a software tool that triggers follow-up steps, provides a centralized place for all information regarding a security incident be stored and viewed, and then ideally automatically disseminates that information when there is an update or a change. So in addition to the software tools that we talked about earlier, a best practice is also to create an internal system for documenting security incidents. And this could be an incident log in and of itself, or it could be additional source of information that is separate to, but goes along with the incident log. From a policy perspective, you need to establish policies for initial reporting. So a requirement that all employees report any suspected security incidents to the right people, whether that's a security officer or to the response team. However that is designed for your organization, that's a standard across the board requirement to report all events. And so that employees aren't, who are not designated are not the ones making an evaluation about whether an event is actually a security incident. And then for ongoing reporting, there are a couple of different ways that this could be done. This could be done by giving discretion to the security officer or to the security incident response team, and just empowering them and requiring them to provide reporting as they see fit. Or you could establish in policy documentation clear defined intervals, so daily or weekly. And then if nothing else, if there isn't an update every day or even every week, the report could still be, just something like still investigating. But however you choose to do it, there needs to be a defined policy for the reporting to all the required parties once an event has been determined to be an actual security incident. And then in terms of policy documentation for the final report, the policy needs to establish a time frame within the conclusion of the investigation 30 days, 60 days, 1 week, whatever is appropriate, that within such time period, the conclusion of the investigation, a certain individual or team will report the incident to certain people. And we'll talk a little bit in a second about what kind of items should be included in incident reports, but it's important to make sure that there is a quantifiable measures of time and who is responsible for reporting and who's responsible for reviewing that report. One other item for this part of the discussion of documentation and reporting is the business associate agreement. That agreement should define as well the reporting standards and the timeframes. And in a little bit, we're going to talk about ranking security incidents as part of the documentation. And to business associates, this is where ranking the severity of an incident can be doubly important, because it can allow the business associate to meet the requirements of the business associate agreement. So if a business associate agreement requires reporting of a certain level of security incident or a security event that may not be counted as an incident, the BA can have some documentation to demonstrate that, well, if they didn't report an event, that it didn't rise to the level that was required by the business associate agreement. So all organizations should keep an incident log. And now we're going to talk about the specific items within that incident log. So as I said, we've got the system log that maintains evidence of issues, but then we've got the manually created incident log that includes the following bulleted items that you see on the PowerPoint in front of you. So the first is a description of the attempted or actual security incident. Again, that's using phraseology similar to the regulatory definition. The date, the time, and the location of the incident, the person who discovered the incident, how the incident was discovered, evidence of the incident. So this could be an audit log or a scan or an email or any number of different items. Mitigation steps. So the steps that we take according to the regulation to reduce or control the harmful effects of the security incident. Corrective actions. So this is different from mitigation because it is the long-term system changes or policy changes that occur as a result of a security incident. So you could buy new software or change out hardware or create new policy or training, and those should all be documented as results of the security incident. And then finally, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, the ranking of severity. So determining how significant the incident was. And in order to do this accurately and consistently, this should be something that's part of your policy documentation, that there's a clear way of ranking this. However that ranking occurs, whether it's 1 through 3, 1 through 5, but each of those different ranking levels is given a definition that is as clear and precise as possible, so that within your organization, if there are follow-up corrective actions that are different based on the ranking, or reporting requirements that are different based on the ranking, or timeframes that are different based on the ranking, or enforcement levels to employees that are different based on the ranking, that the policy documentation gives clear guidance on what that severity is, and then when the incident log is being completed, that ranking is given so that the next appropriate steps can be taken. So, and in order to have a system log that is effective, especially with respect to the evidence of the incident and then the mitigation and corrective actions, our systems have to be, we have to ensure that they're documenting as they were designed to do. So we need to be reviewing to make sure the audit logs are ongoing, they're being completed in an ongoing fashion, scans are being completed in an ongoing fashion, and that the documentation of the scans is being recorded. And then second, we need to ensure that that system documentation provides the necessary information to identify and respond to incidents. So it's one thing if our system is documenting different activities, but that documentation doesn't provide us the information we need to establish evidence of the incident or to determine what are the appropriate mitigation steps or the corrective actions, then we need to reevaluate the kind of documentation that our system is providing to us. So as I mentioned, with respect to policies, we need to require incident documentation. We need to identify the timeframes for completing that incident documentation. And some of the documentation may not be, completing that documentation may not be appropriate while an investigation is ongoing. So I want to acknowledge that, but more broadly, to just require that an incident log, for example, that an incident log be required in policy, and that even more specifically, that the incident log would contain all of the specific items, whether it's the ones that I've listed or more or less, whatever the specific elements that are required to be included in the incident log, those should be documented in policy. And then finally, designated individuals or teams responsible for doing the investigative work, the corrective work, the ranking, and the documentation. So the next issue to address is the response part to security incidents, beyond just the documentation, the investigation and documentation. But when you've gotten to the phase where you've identified that an incident has occurred, and you're now addressing an actual security incident instead of just investigating whether one has occurred. So there's a couple of different parts to the whole response part. One is, after you've done the root cause analysis in your investigation. The second is your mitigation phase. So reducing the harmful effects. And there's a couple of different ways that can be done. You can change passwords to affected systems. You need to determine whether it's safe to resume operation of certain systems. Checking backup systems to see if they're functioning or if they're affected. It may involve increased monitoring of systems. So if something was being monitored once a week, it may go to daily, or if it was something was being monitored daily, it maybe go into a continuous monitoring system. But whatever the need is based on the severity and the nature of the incident, increased monitoring is one of the mitigation tools. And then finally, fixing whatever the security issues are in terms of an immediate situation. So if there's, an example where a laptop or a group of laptops is impacted, immediately either removing those and providing new laptops or fixing those laptops so that they are useful again. And then the next stage is to restore a system to functionality. So, one of the things that can occur during the mitigation stage is to take a system or device offline in order to prevent further damage. And this is something that would be broader than just a temporary solution that's discussed or addressed during the mitigation phase. But this is the complete and full restoration of everything to its functioning capacity before the security incident actually occurred. And then once we've restored, then the final stage is our corrective actions. And so this is where we determine what changes need to be made beyond just restoring the system to functionality. So what kind of big or small changes to software or hardware or policy or procedure or training or processing need to occur in order to prevent the same kind of incident or similar incidents from occurring again. And this is where it's helpful to, again, just like at the beginning phase and where we're identifying what a security incident actually is, this is where it's helpful to bring in not just the security officer, not just the security incident response team or legal counsel, but to bring everyone in to talk about what kind of changes need to be made and how those changes should be made to prevent a repeat of the security incident. In terms of system changes for the response, it's hard to discuss this, but it depends on the nature of the incident. So this is where it's going to be, the corrective action step is going to be so important in terms of the response, is to be able to identify what kind of system changes need to be made. In terms of policies, there are a few items that I can think of. First is just to identify who is responsible for all of these different steps. So who's responsible for conducting the investigation, who is responsible for ensuring mitigation, who is responsible for restoration, and who is responsible for the correction at the end. It may be that each of those steps includes all of the same people, but some of those steps include different people. It may be that all of those steps involve are ultimately responsible. Someone different is responsible for each of those different steps. Whatever the process and the decision is, it should be documented who's responsible for investigation, who's responsible for mitigation, who's responsible for restoration, and then finally who's responsible for correction. And then a second item in terms of policy documentation for the response part is what kind of reporting is required from technical teams to the operational management, compliance, and legal teams. So a root cause analysis is something that's going to require, significant technical expertise. And so a documentation in the policies should include what kind of communication and analysis should be reported from those technical teams conducting that investigation, and the mitigation and the restoration back to the operational compliance and management teams in order to comply with the requirements. And then final, and one that I see a challenge with when I conduct auditing activities is testing the corrective actions. And so this is something that's important from a system perspective, a policy perspective, and then just a discussion perspective, is ensuring that that the implemented solutions to prevent another repeat of the security incident actually work as designed. It's one of the things that's frequently occurs is an organization experiences a breach or an incident, and they do a root cause analysis like they should, they mitigate like they should, they restore like they should, and then they have a discussion and a decision on how to correct it, and they implement the corrective action as was discussed, but then no one tests it. And so coming back through to evaluate whether or not the corrective action actually worked, we find that it's not working at all, and occasionally the corrective action may cause other vulnerabilities and security issues and other considerations that may need to be addressed. So one of the areas that I want to stress in terms of the response is when you get to the corrective action phase is that it can be sometimes a struggle to finally get the solution implemented that was discussed during the corrective action phase, but it's not just implemented, but it's tested to make sure that it's working as it's designed to work. Okay, so then the final issue to address when evaluating security incident response requirements under the security rule are trends, whether or not identifying patterns of attempted security incidents is reasonable and appropriate. So certain incidents happen with such frequency that trending may not be appropriate, the firewall scams that I mentioned earlier. Other incidents such as a denial of service attack or phishing expedition, those are hopefully less frequent and can be reviewed in order to identify whether the activity is becoming a pattern, so that it's more than just a one-off event, but it is something that is repeatedly testing what may be a weakness in a security management system. And so one of the things that should govern this, do you evaluate whether patterns are, whether it's appropriate to look for trends and patterns, is your risk analysis. This is where you should use the work that you've already put into a risk analysis to identify where your highest risks are and your highest impacts are, so that those areas would be the areas that should be given more consideration to conducting trending. So the first question is this becoming a pattern? You have to decide what kind of level of activity would be subject to trending review, and then document that in policy. And then the second question is, if you've identified that this activity is something that's subject to trending and it looks like it's a trend, then the next question is, so, how do we know that it's a trend? How are we evaluating this? So are your systems designed in a way to preferably automatically identify when things are happening with repetition, whether attacks are coming from a certain area, whether there are a certain number of attacks, whether there's certain virus, whether there's certain activity that's happening on a repeated basis. The best way to know that is to design systems and to implement tools that will notify you on your own, rather than having to do a kind of manual review. However, conducting a manual review is still better than conducting none at all. So you know whether something is becoming a pattern when your systems tell you, or when you conduct a manual review of the kind of regular review that is required on the security rule. So this isn't just this activity to identify patterns can actually help comply with a requirement on its own. So, and then finally, in terms of incident trending, we want to make sure that you have documentation for reports of trends and corrective actions of trends. So what kind of activity is different with respect to trends than, if any, than for a single security incident that is on its own. And again, this may involve your risk analysis. This may involve the ranking of severity, so that incidents that are on the highest severity, if those are a trend, the follow-up action should be significantly more pressing and significant and comprehensive than a trend of the lowest risk, even if there should still be a response to that because of the trend. The policy documentation in your systems should establish what you do when you find a trend. So now that we've talked about these different issues of defining incidents, documentation and reporting, and then incident trending, one of the questions that we addressed at the very beginning is the overlap or the difference between a security incident and a breach. As you may be wondering, is there really a separate requirement for incident response? I thought everything that was a security issue with respect to HIPAA was just a breach. So what happened to the breaches? Did they go away? And the answer is no. They still have a separate requirements for a security breach. So first, this is confusing, and regulators haven't done us a great service by the language that they've used. So this is confusing, but I think we can provide enough clarity to help us understand the difference between the two. And a security incident is something that can turn into a breach, and a security incident becomes a breach when PHI is actually compromised. So you could have a security incident that could occur that can meet the definition of the regulation as per the security rule, and it doesn't actually involve PHI. And in that case, it wouldn't be a breach. It could be an interference with a system that is a part of your organization, but a system that doesn't process PHI, or it could be access to a system that doesn't process PHI or contain PHI or transmit PHI. So you would have a security incident as per the rule, but you wouldn't have PHI, so it wouldn't be a breach, because a breach is when PHI is compromised. Or you could have an incident that involved PHI access to or destruction of or interference of a system that involves PHI that's encrypted or de-identified, so that, again, a compromise of PHI may not have occurred. So an incident can rise to the level of breach, and what happens depends on the evaluation of the factors that are detailed in the breach notification requirements. So think about a security incident as kind of like a baseline for breach notification requirements, and that everything that is a security incident, so first you have the first level of analysis is something a security incident. As as the rule requires and as your policies and procedures documented. And then if it is, the next level of analysis is the security incident a breach? Did it involve PHI, and is that PHI, was it compromised in any capacity? So think of them in terms of layers of analysis. The first is a security incident, and the second is a breach. So just to kind of wrap things up before we offer a few minutes for a question and answer session. First, the requirements for security incident. You must identify, respond, mitigate, report, and document. And those 5 different responses, or 5 different requirements will occur in different phases depending on the analysis and the activity. And they should be enabled. Meeting those requirements is dependent on having the proper systems and policies in place in order to make sure that your organization knows what constitutes a security incident. They know how to respond, they know how to mitigate, they know what to report, and they know what to document. And that information, that knowledge is not only the information itself, but the ability to do it with the systems that support it. And then finally, you have the people that are necessary. You have your security officer plus response teams plus legal counsel plus compliance and operations, and that may require bringing in outside individuals as well to help evaluate, to help mitigate, and to help implement and test corrective action activity. So I hope this has been helpful in bringing some clarity into a requirement that is part of addressing breach notification, but less than, or different from at least, and something that is not spelled out with a lot of specificity and particularity in the security rule, but based on industry practices of designing policies and systems, identifying people, and spelling out the different requirements, I think we can aspire to reasonable compliance with the requirements. So thank you for your participation and your in this presentation, and we'll open it up to questions if anybody has any.
Great, thank you, Mark. I just want to remind everyone to use the Q&A feature to share any questions that you might have. We have a few so far. How long do we have to keep incident reporting records?
So since you're required to document security incidents, it's a natural to ask how long you have to keep those records, and it's the standard 6 years for incident reporting.
Okay. Let's see, what do I do if I have a service provider who is supposed to help with incident response requirements?
So if you have, if you've already planned to bring in a service provider to help you with incident response requirements, there's a couple of things, 3 things that you need to do. One is make sure that they are up to the task. Make sure that service provider has mature security standards that are based on industry best practices, and that they have experience dealing with healthcare incident response. Like I said, it's the idea and concept and topic of incident response is something that anybody with secure or private or confidential information is going to have to deal with. But unless they're talking about PHI, they're not going to have to deal with the specific requirements under the security rules. So the best approach is to make sure a service provider is up to the task based on their experience with HIPAA requirements. The second is to make sure that your service provider agreement clearly spells out what the security provider does and doesn't do, and that you're satisfied with what your service provider agreement says, so that you don't get in a situation where you're expecting your service provider to facilitate in identifying potential security incidents when they are not actively doing that because the security or the service provider agreement doesn't require them to. Instead, if they believe it only requires them to help you in response and mitigation and corrective action, then you'd have a significant challenge. So make sure your service provider agreement is clear and that you're satisfied with what that clarity brings. And then finally, just like the corrective action part is to run a test. One of the things that can happen when an entity engages a service provider for something that doesn't happen, has never happened or doesn't happen with much frequency is that there's a lot of uncertainties about how the interaction will occur and how the service will be provided, even if the agreement between the two parties is clear. So just run a test of a security incident that would require the service provider to perform its functions under the agreement and see how that goes. And that will give you some confidence, I'm sure, about your incident response program.
Great. Okay, it looks like we've got time for about one more question before we wrap up. So what should we do if we are concerned that we may have had an incident sometime in the past?
So if you think that you've had an incident and it didn't undergo the kind of evaluation that we talked about during this presentation, hopefully first you have system records that are maintained, not just the incident response records that we talked about, but that was the first question, but your system records, your audit logs, your scans, your other documentation, any internal audits or monitoring reports. Hopefully those system records are maintained not just for the immediate past, a week or so, but for a little bit longer term so that you can audit those records to determine whether or not you had a security incident. If you have policies and procedures that define security incident and they give you an operational response like we discussed, then go through it as if it just occurred and treat it according to your policies and procedures. The best approach is to address it like it just happened with immediacy and urgency. And if you don't have those policies and procedures, then the step would be you got to create and decide what your definition is, and that's going to be tough to do, but it's going to be important to make sure that you're evaluating so that if it's not a security incident, if it's just an event, then you don't unnecessarily go through all the rest of the steps. But that if it is a security incident, that you've done a fair and objective evaluation based on what your operational definition is, and then you take all the required steps after that.
Great, thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for sharing this information with us today. What you're seeing now on the screen is our roadmap of HIPAA compliance topics that we've talked about so far this year. So if you see any up there that are interesting, that you've missed, you can get on our website, www.kirkpatrickprice.com/webinars, and you can find the recordings for all of those there. And coming up next month, towards the end of October, we will be doing a webinar on cybersecurity and the NIST framework, so be on the lookout for those invitations in your inbox. And I'll go on and give everyone the rest of the hour back. If you have any further questions, feel free to contact Mark. His contact information is up there on the screen. And I hope you all have a good rest of the day.